start out talking about the protocol that we've used, and then we'll talk about some of the specific types of implementation that we've done as in our own process as we tried this formal protocol at Poway Adult School. We'll give you some of our results and some of our insights. And then Pam is going to take you through some guided practice. So you'll have an opportunity to apply this same protocol looking at some data. Oh, and I know that Veronica, when she was introducing, mentioned that we'll have time at the end for questions. But I also did want to encourage you as we're going along, if you want to just make note of any questions in the chat pod. We want this to be conversational. So if there's something you want to know more about or have a question, you don't have to hold those questions to the end. We're happy to answer them as we go along. So I think if you've ever seen a presentation that I've done, you've probably seen this quote because it is one of my favorite quotes in the world. If you want to change the culture, you have to change the conversation. And so I like this quote because it has been very true for me as we've tried to do anything new, and I'll say even in our district or at a local program level, as we get people or groups of people talking about things and focusing on things, we really start to create culture. We're starting to make sense of our understanding as a collective, and that all influences culture. So some of you have probably been involved in efforts to adopt a mission statement or to adopt value statements or a vision for your school. And so when you engage in those conversations, you'll probably remember having had the opportunity to really think about or argue even about specific words and their meanings. And so when that happens and people are discussing specific things, they're agreeing or they're listening to each other, and then they're forming this culture. And so that's really what we try to do. Our agency participated, as some of you may have participated in professional learning communities. We've participated in learner persistence study circles, and we've done book studies, as some of you I'm sure have done. And so when we do those things, we're really trying to influence culture and a shared understanding of how we approach our work. And so it's no different when we talk about a data dialogue. We're engaging in conversation, and we're starting to make that data and the practice of analyzing our data part of our culture. So I just wanted to start with that. And then some background information. And so if you've downloaded the handouts, handout 1 kind of walks you through some key concepts. And so the first time we got our group of staff members together, we really took a look at some of these key concepts. And like many of you, Poway Unified School District is a district that has long used interest-based problem solving. And so some of these concepts and the whole idea of dialogue really has roots in that interest-based problem solving process, or IBPS. And so on your handout, you can see that I've just labeled a few things under discussion. Generally, when you're discussing something, the goal is that you're trying to reach a decision. You might be advocating specific ideas. Generally, it is one idea against another. And so you might hear people saying, yes, but. And so when we talk about dialogue on the other end of the spectrum, we're really seeking to understand. So the goal is to understand the other viewpoint. It's to suspend our own point of view in order to listen for and understand the third story. Looking at a larger context, trying to give meaning to maybe what appears to be two opposing points of view. And so the outcome we're looking for is a yes and kind of an outcome. And then we also took our staff through discussion about levels of listening. So I've just listed those three things. Defensive listening, you've probably heard this many, many times before, but defensive listening would be, I have my own viewpoint and I'm listening to you just so I can get to say my point of view next. And so that what you're really trying to do is not hear what the other person is saying. You're really listening because you're excited to tell them what, how your answer is right or how your perspective is right. The perspective taking listening is a little similar to defensive listening. So you might be able to say, well, I understand that's your perspective, but this is my perspective. So we can agree to disagree. And then when we talk about empathetic listening, which is really kind of what the goal is, that where we're trying to get to, it's really to understand what that other person's point of view is and what their experience is and why they see things, being able to see it as they see it. So when we started to work with our staff on a data dialogue, the very first place we started was some of these places. What's the difference between discussion? What's the difference? What does dialogue mean versus discussion? Can you think of times when you've engaged in different levels of listening? And can you train yourself to develop almost your own internal ear so you hear yourself taking positions versus really doing, practicing empathetic listening? And then we watched a couple videos. There's some good YouTube videos that talk about the difference between discussion and dialogue. On your handout, I put a little YouTube video for Brene Brown talks about empathy. And so just to get discussions going so people kind of understand these concepts, these might be some starting points for you. And then always having in the back of your mind these three questions. Am I advocating my position or am I seeking to understand? Am I being certain or am I being curious? So when you're asking questions, are you asking questions because you genuinely want to know and want to understand the person's perspective? And then what's the third story? What's the both and? And so as we started to look at this particular data dialogue, we liked it because it really reflected, we felt like it reflected those concepts that we had been exploring in IBPS, interest-based problem solving. I think it models a lot of practices that we talk to our teachers about practicing in their classrooms, like private think time and waiting for students to come up with the answers and letting people really have time to form opinions collectively. So, even when you've done facilitation of groups, I'm sure each of you has had that opportunity to try to capture another person's thoughts exactly as they said them. So not spinning them into your own words, but first to hear them exactly as the other person said. And then if you want to put your own spin on it, you can, but just reflecting active listening. So that's just a little bit of the background information that we started with. And so now I'm going to kind of move you into this very specific data dialogue protocol that we adopted. And so the data dialogue protocol that we adopted is from the School Reform Initiative. That was the source. So we didn't develop this. We were just smart enough to find it and to use it. And so you can see that there are several steps in the process. The first is that before you even pass out any data, you ask people to make predictions. You might tell them, oh, we're going to look at enrollment data from the past 5 years, and then people would make predictions about what they think they are going to see. Then you distribute and examine the data. People have an opportunity to ask additional clarifying questions. Then you go visual. And we're going to talk more about each one of these steps. They make observations, and then they're able to make inferences. And then you walk away from the data dialogue protocol with identifying the implications for teaching and learning. So part of this idea of the predictions, again, is just a way to maybe acknowledge that people like to be right. And so we all have opinions and beliefs about why something is the way that it is. So people have a chance to kind of get their predictions out on the table. But then they are, as you're looking at data, suspending their own judgment and their own points of view until they have a chance to kind of look at this as a group. So the next slide talks about the facilitation plan. So when you implement the data dialogue protocol, the School Reform Initiative says that it takes about 60 to 90 minutes. And so they've given a particular time frame to each of the activities, as you can see here. When we've implemented this in Poway, we've always done it with a 90-minute time frame. I think 60 minutes might be kind of pushing it a little bit. So we've always done it in a 90-minute time frame. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the reasons behind why we did it, and then talk a little bit more about how we implemented it. And then we'll get into talking about some of the specific phases. So we actually had a number of iterations of looking at data in our organization before we decided to adopt this formal data dialogue protocol. We had a targets and deadlines meeting a long time ago, really probably like 10 or 12 years ago, where we would get people together and we would look at data. And what happened is that there were so many people who wanted to come to the targets and deadlines meeting that we decided that we would disband that group and we would just look at data in our staff meetings. And then, to be perfectly honest with you, that was that was a huge failure because we never had time to look at data in our staff meetings, or we were hurried because we had other agenda items, and so we didn't spend the time that we really needed to be sure that people looked at data and understood the data and were thoughtful about what does it mean to us, and are there changes that we need to make with our program? And so we also had staff turnover. So, maybe we had done training once upon a time, but it was surprising to us to learn that, oh, although we trained on this 5 years ago, these 6 people came in after that time, so they really didn't know the same thing. So we didn't have a common understanding. We didn't have a culture around our data. And so those were the problems really that we were trying to solve. So the first year that I decided to adopt this data dialogue protocol, I invited everyone on our staff and said we were going to have 5 meetings in the first year, and I wanted people who were interested in participating to commit to attend all 5 of the meetings. And so we met at lunchtime. We met from 12:30 in the afternoon to 2 p.m. We did start and end on time. And we organized the meeting around that data dialogue protocol and the time frame that I showed you on the previous slide. And in terms of how much did it cost, we did pay our staff to attend. So we paid our teachers to attend, and then we also provided lunch. So for those 5 meetings, it was a small budget to be able to implement. So I'm moving along here. So what type of data did we use? And how did we decide which data to review? So we started simply. So like I said earlier, you could start with the most basic data. So you could start with enrollment data and looking at enrollment data over the past couple of years. We also have been looking at our payment point summary data. And you can compare that to prior years. We've looked at our data integrity report. We've looked at our NRS table data. We've compared our performance to other districts, either locally or the state, to kind of see how we're doing. And so generally what, Pam or I may have an idea about a particular area that we want to focus on, but most often at the meeting, we talk about, one of the things we do before we end a meeting is we talk about what data do we want to look at next time? What data is going to, what do we want to see next? What's going to make a difference for us to see next? So I'm going to move along here. So the first year that we implemented this, we were amazed at the results that we got just from, it's really not rocket science. It's just eking out time in your schedule to follow a process to look at data. So the very first year that we implemented this, we doubled our payment points for EL Civics. Our adult secondary education payment points increased by more than 30%. We increased the numbers of our paired scores. And although we didn't increase enrollments, we improved outcomes with existing students. So I think that how we looked at it is we were serving the students that we were serving better. And then we asked our teachers to give us some feedback about what they thought about participation. And so some of the things that they told us, they enjoyed the discussion without judgment. They thought it was informative. They focused instruction on topics. They were able to, it was kind of a validation of their work, I think. They were able to see how the flow among programs. So how are students transitioning from one program to another? They enjoyed getting to see the bigger picture. They said that it increased their understanding of how we get paid. So the WIOA payment points. They also enjoyed different voices in the collaboration because, as I mentioned, we opened it up to everyone. So we had classified staff participating along with program managers. We had some teachers, a counselor, but teachers from different areas. So it was an interesting grouping of people, and that has continued since we started this. So, what to consider? So, one of the things that I think was difficult at first was there is just fear of airing data publicly. So I think, having a safe environment where people know that we're looking at data and we're all learning from the data that we're looking at, and it isn't a judgment on anything. We're looking at it so we can improve and where we can look at things. But I think that was something that that definitely started, that initially caused some fear about participating. Um, we also learned that we didn't always have the answers. So sometimes we would ask questions and look at data that we needed an expert to help us understand the data better, or what the relationship a relationship was between different data points, or were among different data points. And so we were able to ask CASAS to help us when we ran into problems where we didn't understand things. We just picked up the phone, or in some cases we had a CASAS representative attend some of our meetings, and they were just able to help us understand things. And they will tell you that they actually enjoyed participating as well. Pat Rickard told me that she feels like her staff got as much out of participating as we did. I don't think that's quite true, but it was really good. We also, the first year, we didn't follow the protocol exactly, and I will say that that was a mistake. We decided to save time that we would skip one of the steps, the Go Visual step, for example, and we learned that we shouldn't do that. The other thing that we did where we deviated from the protocol that I would recommend you not do is we had a number of people who wanted us to send the data out to them ahead of time. And they wanted to be able to look at the data before the meeting. And our recommendation is that you follow the protocol exactly and you not send the data out ahead of time. And I guess what I would say about that is when people look at the data ahead of time, they have this opportunity to form opinions about the data without participating in the whole process and without participating in the team. And so I think it makes it harder to have the dialogue if people are coming in with their own ideas. So deviating from the protocol is something that the second year of implementation, we said, okay, we're not doing that. We're going to follow it exactly. And that was, something that the group really reflected on and agreed that that's how we should move forward. I think what the next slide really tells you a little bit about some of our next steps. So after the first year of implementation, one of the things we said is, yes, we want to continue this process. So we're in our 4th year of implementation now. Each year I issue a new invitation, and again, I send that out to everyone and invite new and returning team members to come to the meeting. And generally, we've had a group of probably between 12 and 15 team members each year. So it's not a huge number, but it's been manageable for us. And then at the end of each meeting, when we talk about implications for teaching and learning, we have those team members talk about how did they go back and take that information back. What did they talk about? What did we learn? What data did we look at? And how are they bringing it back to their departments, their program areas, or what have you. We did have some accomplishments. So we expanded our practice of PLCs, and we incorporated student goals into our process. As a result of what we learned in the data dialogue. We also reviewed our board policy and changed our graduation requirements as a result of some of the things we were looking at with data dialogue. This year in process, we're still incorporating some acceleration strategies, and we're integrating instruction. So those are some of the next steps and pieces that we're following. So I'm just going to stop here. I've been doing a lot of talking. I don't know if I lost anyone along the way, but are there any questions for me at this point before we let you do some practicing? If you have a question, you can just type it in your chat pod. I see nobody typing. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Pam, and she's going to walk us through the guided practice. So Pam, I'm going to mute, but I'll be listening in, and we'll chime in at some point.
Okay, it looks like we have will be the yes, there will be an audio of the meeting. I think it is being recorded, yes, to Barbara. I see the note there. Okay, so your turn. We're going to go through a little bit of the practice. And we're starting with phase 1 of your predictions. And so at this point, you haven't seen your third handout, hopefully. And I'm just going to tell you what we're going to be looking at. One of the things that we're looking at now as a consortium is our data that is being rolled up. So we took our 2017-2018 consortium roll-up data and put it onto a graph for you. So you're going to be looking at literacy gains, outcomes, and services. So what I want you to do is just think about that for a minute or two, and you can type in just what you think some of those predictions might be. And here's you're going to say, I assume, I predict, I wonder, you whatever you think it's going to look like. And it can be any kind of a prediction at all. So go ahead and take just a minute or two and type what you think the consortium roll-up literacy gains, outcomes, and services data would look like. No, we're not looking. No, we're not looking at the handout yet. Okay, good. So it looks good. Barbara writes, I assume the literacy gains will increase. Paul wrote, I wonder what program areas had the most students. Bethany says, I wonder which program area had the most EFL gains. Jennifer writes, I wonder how our data looks on the other side of entry. And I predict ESL has more students than other programs. And that was from Yuri. And let's see, over here on the other side, a few people are on the other chat box. I wonder if the data will improve my teaching, assuming scores and services will be up, differences between the data and different agencies. Oh boy, there's lots of wondering going on. Great. I wonder how many students obtained a high school diploma. Okay. Now, normally when you're doing this with your group, you would have folks do exactly this, think about it, write some things down, and then you would go around the room one by one and ask exactly the questions. So Barbara, what do you think? Jennifer, what did you think? And everyone would give their predictions. And you can go through until until they're all exhausted. Okay. Vincent, more English learners enrolled in high school program. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to let you, I think everyone stopped typing at this point. So now your next slide would be that you would actually get the data, okay? So go ahead and open your handout number 3 if you haven't already done so, the one that says please do not open until prompted. And if you download that file, then you'll actually see the data that we're going to be looking at. Okay. Now, at this point, we would say to you, you can work in pairs, you can work individually. What we normally do is we bring in large Post-it paper. Some people work on their computers. You can work directly on the data itself, and you can highlight trends. You can do math calculations. You can just pick a part of the data. You don't have to try to do all of the data, but you would just pick a piece of the data and try to go visual with it. Sometimes you'll have a group working together. They'll come up with a whole huge graph, bar graph, or something like that. Or sometimes it could be a simple piece of data, and someone may just write directly onto the form itself. So I'm going to move to, oh, nope, that's not right. There we go. So here's an example for you, and I just did one very simple thing, is I took the data and I said, oh, who's got the most enrollees? And of course, and some of you predicted, that English language learners were the largest number of enrollees and also had the largest number of services. And the second largest, which for a lot of us may be a surprise, was the CTE area and also had the second largest number of services needed. Now, somebody else may pull out a completely different piece of the data to go visual with, and hopefully they do, because it just brings in more and more conversation. Okay? So now this is the hardest section to do, the phase 3 observations. And I'm going to give you some time to do this. On this particular section, you want to just talk about the facts. You want to say you observe, make your observations. You see some patterns or trends. You can tell us what you count, or what you might be surprised to see. Um, but you want to be careful. You don't want to say because of or anything like that. You don't want to say however or it seems that therefore. This is just the facts. So I want you to take, let's say, about 5 minutes, because it does take a little time to go through, and make your observations. And when you do make your observations, go ahead and put it into your chat, the observations chat pod.
We have a little bit more than 1 minute left in the 5 minutes.
Alrighty, everyone, that is time. Thank you. So we've gotten some great observations here. And remember, these are just facts. We're not going to make any decisions about anything yet, right? So, you know, yes. Let's see, going back to the top. Surprised that there are not more enrollees in adults with disabilities. I observed that there are 3 different program totals, and we will get to the why maybe in the next section. Completion rate is for HSE is higher than HDSD high school diploma, and 58% of ELLs have a pre-post achievement. So we have a lot of good observations here. Surprised that so few are pre-apprenticeship enrollees. That more students are taking the high set, yes. 75% of the high school HSE students pre and post with only 67% of high school. And let's see. Okay, very similar at the bottom too. You've transitioned post-secondary education 7%, for ESLs 3%. Okay. And finally, basic skills has a small number of literacy gains. Okay. All right. So that is a lot of great observation. And now, when we move into inferences, this is where you need to make some decisions about what you're seeing. And also, we might want to, this is where you would also say, maybe I need additional data to help me verify or explain something. And maybe some appropriate solutions to address maybe some of the needs that could be implied. And again, do we need additional data to look at to determine solutions? So this would also be where you might want to say how this could affect teaching and learning as well. And please let's take another 5 minutes, 5 or 6 minutes to do that, because I think this will be the part where we can have a discussion, or a dialogue, I should say, about the inferences. And again, this is where you would kind of say, I believe the data suggests because additional data would help me to verify. I think the following are appropriate solutions or responses that address the needs of the implied data, additional resources that might be needed, and implications for teaching and or student learning would be great.
Okay, everybody, we have about 2 minutes left. This is the 2-minute warning.
All right, everybody, that's time. So let's go through some of your inferences. You see a lot of really interesting inferences here. So Cindy noted at the very beginning that the data suggests that the HSE high school diploma is required for participation in CTE programs because the number achieving those in those programs is smaller than all the other programs except for the pre-apprenticeship. So that's very insightful. I like that. Um, and Quinn, yes, we actually do have the data broken out by consortium participants, but we actually didn't bring all of that in. That would be a lot to look at here. But yes, it is another interesting way from we all look at that. Um, and I like Vincent the data supports the needs in the community. Yes, um, and HSE is more popular than, or high school diploma is more popular, yet HSE is a reality, producing more outcomes. And that was from Campbell. Yes, I agree. I've seen that a lot in a lot of other data as well. That seems to be the case. And let's see, Thomas. Uh, okay, so on the parent education, I think we have that embedded in some of our ESL programs, but we don't have just particular parent education alone. So you're right. I think there is a need, but we don't necessarily show it on this data. And let's see, the average hours of instruction. Yeah, that would be interesting because that would vary very much across the different schools. And that was from Bethany on data on employment barriers for ABE. Yeah, that would be another set to look at. And Yuri, on the adults with disabilities, I think only one of our sites has an adults with disabilities program. All the other sites, we do have services for adults with disabilities, but it's all embedded in either ABE or ESL or ASE. So they're not specifically called out. And yes, so we actually have an adults with disability specialist that works with all of our sites, Teresa, just so you know that. So, but yes, that this data does not show that. So you're correct. Um, and yes, always pre-post testing would make it has to be investigated. And let's see. Yes, and we have another thing that let's see. Yeah, that the CTE services have get services in multiple areas, and certainly we try to serve all students in whatever area they need. Um, and let's see. Career services followed for CTE and HSE. Mm-hmm. Same career service options. And we're this was last year, and we only started collecting the service program area data, which is really kind of difficult to collect. And I think this next year will look a lot better. Right. Uh, yes. So, Joseph, I believe the data suggests that there are barriers to HSE completion because the success rate of those enrolled to those who graduate is a 19%. Yep. So those are excellent inferences. And uh, when you have the different program areas in the room discussing these different options or different areas exactly like you did, they often can give a little bit more information. Well, like this year, our enrollment was way down in ASE or something like that. So a lot of times as they get going, they can really see a lot of what you've pointed out and decide, gee, maybe we need to do something in a particular area. So I see we have a few more people still typing. um, so one of the other things that, just to sort of round up what the whole process is, we usually have a facilitator who is typing these types of notes up. And so all throughout, when people are making their predictions all the way to the inferences, someone is typing that up and keeping like a note record of it so that when we come back the second time, we might want to look at more data to explain something. Yes. And CTE, effective program for capturing pre and post. Yeah, well, that's another whole area, doesn't it? Isn't it? Okay, Barbara, thanks. And that opens it up to any additional questions that you may have, and I'll let Kathleen jump back in here too.
Thanks, Pam. I was just going to make a couple of comments based on your comments for inferences, because I think that by going through that, even though this was a really abbreviated process, I hope that you can see how the inferences that you came up with would be useful in determining the data that you look at the next meeting. The questions that people ask, or they're saying, oh, I think that having more information about this. I think you can also see how the data tells a story from inferences, and sometimes the stories that the data tell the inferences isn't the correct story. So having the inference and then knowing that we need more data because the story isn't told. We want a different story. So some of the things I think, with the parent ed, there was a comment about parent ed and a comment about services to students with disabilities, which I think if we looked at that data, we'd say, wow, that doesn't look right. What's going on? And so usually as we start looking at next steps or the implications of the data, It might have an implication for a process. It might have an implication to, a program, or it might have an implication for instruction. So when we talk about the process, sometimes it might be just where and how we collect the data. It might be a training issue. It might be how we're collecting data from students in the orientation. Maybe something needs to be changed with that process. In terms of the program, I was thinking about, the pre-apprenticeship or students with disabilities. If we're looking at a whole program area where you're starting to see, wow, our data doesn't look the way we expected it to look. So does that mean that we need to add a program? Do we need to look at how these programs articulate what is it that's happening? And then with instruction, I think most often we start to look at competencies. So one of the reports we can look at is how are students doing with particular competencies? And are there particular competencies that maybe as an organization we need to adopt because we see that the majority of our students might benefit from having additional instruction or emphasis in that particular competency. So those are just some of my closing thoughts, but I think we do want to open it up to you all for any questions that you have at this point. I see a couple people are typing.
While we're waiting, I'll also add, we gave you a lot of data to look at. And I would suggest when you start out, you just say take your payment point data and you do that comparing it from one year to another or something like that. When you get good at the process and the protocol, then you can do whatever kind of data you want, but you might want to start with something a little more simple than what we gave you here today.
Oh, Barbara asks, is it pretty much the same teachers that participate? You mean each year? No, we've had new groups of people coming in. We have some that are, I'll call old timers. They won't like it that I'm calling them old timers, but we have some that are returning. But we really have had new people come into the group every year, which has been great. And Yuri, I see no questions at your end. I'm glad you found it informative. And I think it will be easy to adapt. It's just, it's kind of a no-brainer thing. If you just set aside some time to look at data, good things are going to happen. But I feel like this particular protocol it has been very, very effective. Barbara asks, has it changed the culture? I think absolutely. I think we're better listeners, and we're better at wanting to ask questions and then have them be proven in data. And so suspending our own beliefs about what we think is happening. We're going to look for data to tell us what's happening, if that makes sense.
And Barbara, also I'd say, because I know you look at data all the time, and I felt the same way. I always look at data, and when I started this process, it really changed how I look at data because you're just so surprised at what people will come up with, even for somebody like you and I who look at data all the time.
So Joseph asks, how opening, is this analysis for teachers? Were you surprised when this was first implemented? Well, I will say, and Pam, you can chime in on this too. I think that our teachers really had not spent as much time with data in this way as we thought. And as I said initially, looking at teacher data was difficult because, people feel like, oh, I'm not doing as well as I should, or you're looking at outcome data, but sometimes it's just following up on another question. So when we had teachers that felt like, geez, I'm not getting the same amount of outcomes as my colleague, sometimes we're able to then look at, well, let's see who you're serving. Is there a difference in who you're serving? And so are there other factors that could be going in? And so then are there particular practices that might work better with some populations than another? Because all of us, it's kind of going back to that basic premise. All of us really just want to get better and better at what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank Teresita. That's sweet. And it's our pleasure. You're welcome, Joseph. I see Irene is typing. While Irene is typing, I'm just going to point out a couple of other things on the PowerPoint, and then we can come back to this. So you have our contact information here. So as you begin to implement, if you find that you have any questions, either Pam or I are very happy to talk with you. And then also we have some references and resources here at the back. And then of course you figured out, I believe, how to download the handouts, which are all in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And so there's a little icon there that I've heard called the hamburger for that pod. So I don't know if it looks like a hamburger. It maybe looks like a Dagwood sandwich or something with the lines. But that's how you could download. If you click on that, you can download the files and then print them if you like. So Irene asks, was the CASA support to calibrate data evaluation team on basics, on reports generate, how to read them? I think when we had CASAS at the table, we just wanted them to have a chance to see how we were discussing data, and then it always turns up that we'll have a question about maybe I'm thinking of an example with the data integrity report, how some of the lines influence others. So you say, oh, is this line a subset of that group? And then the answer is yes or no, because sometimes when you look at the data, you might assume that one group is a subset. I think one of the comments that was made when we were looking at observations was that, oh, it looks like maybe our CTE programs require people to have their high school diploma because the high school diploma and high school equivalency group was smaller than the CTE group. So we would be able to ask that question. Is that true? Is this a subset or is it a distinct group? And in that particular case, it would be a distinct group. There may be overlap, and then again, there may not be. So I think sometimes we'll have a question where we'll say, well, what data will answer that question? Is there a report that would give us this? And then we've been able to kind of look through reports or get help from CASAS about which report would give us this information. So if we wanted to know about this, how could we find that? Um, the other thing that CASA staff, they've sent a couple of their new employees to sit in on our data dialogue, which has been kind of fun because then those employees have the opportunity to see how the field is actually using the reports and how how the end user manages or doesn't manage the information that's presented, if that makes sense.
And it helps that we're only like 40 minutes away from Casas's main building, so
Does it take
they
you
were able to
40
come.
minutes, Pam?
Well,
I must be a speeder.
without traffic, with traffic.
Okay, great. So I see a couple more people are typing, so I'm going to wait and see what pops up there. You're welcome. Okay, Sharita, we're glad you're here. Okay, so if we don't have more questions, I'm going to turn things back over to Veronica to close. But we were very happy to spend the afternoon with you all and appreciate you tuning in. And once again, if there's anything that we can do to help support you in your implementation, we'd be very happy to answer questions or talk with you more about it.
Thank you all.
Right. Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Pam, for this afternoon's webinar. I hope everyone who were in attendance found it very useful and informative, as some have already mentioned. I'm about to close the webinar, but before I do, I want to let you know that this webinar recording, as well as the materials, will be available on the California Adult Education website under Professional Learning and Student Data Reporting, and I provided a link of where you can find that in about 30 minutes or so, it will be available. So if you have colleagues who would find this information useful or you'd like to share it with your consortium or your school, please be sure to send them to the website to view these materials. In addition, please be sure to register for upcoming webinars. Tomorrow we will have Jay who will be on, and he will be talking about using assessment results to inform instruction. So this is definitely geared towards our instructors as well as administrators. So if you have any instructors who will find this information valuable, please be sure to ask them to log on tomorrow, and then I'll also place the URL to register here. And I will close the webinar now, and when I do, please be sure to fill out the evaluation and let Kathleen and Pam know what you thought about their presentation this afternoon. If you have any additional questions, if there's any additional technical assistance or professional development that you're in need of at this time. Again, thank you all very much for participating in today's webinar, and we hope that everyone have a great evening.